Hi, this is Paul, and welcome to After Effects. In this video, I want to get you comfortable with working in After Effects for the very first time. We're going to go over the basics of the interface and some of the tools, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be ready to work on your very first After Effects composition. Now, we'll be using After Effects CS6 for this tutorial, but if you're using CS5 or anything earlier, most of the concepts will be the same, so you should be just fine. Now, when you first open After Effects, you'll probably see a window a lot like this, Welcome to Adobe After Effects. In CS6, it shows recent projects over here, of which we have none. It'll also give you an option to open a new project, or an existing project rather, start a new composition, browse other compositions in Bridge, or go for some help and support. What's very useful is they'll always also show a tip of the day in this window, and you can tab through these manually. When you're first starting out, these can be incredibly helpful. There's some great advice in the tip of the day. If you don't want to see this window every time you start up After Effects, you can click this checkbox in the lower left. For now, we're just going to click Close. So here's the main After Effects window. This is the default layout known as Standard. There are lots of other preset layouts that we'll show you in a little bit, and you can also adjust these panels to be any way you want. And when you first start off, you probably are best off just using the panels as they're presented to you, but as you get more comfortable in the software, you may want to customize it to work exactly the way you like to work. Now, the main center window here is called the Composition panel. This is where you'll see whatever you're working on. This is the actual viewport into your project. So this will be your sort of what you see is what you get area. On the bottom, this is the timeline. This is just like in Final Cut Pro or iMovie or Premiere or any number of other video editing software. This is your timeline. The timeline in After Effects is a little different than what you may be used to in those other programs, but we'll go over that in a bit. It's not that bad. Over here on the left is your project panel. Now, this is where all of your files, all of your assets are going to live. After Effects links to your assets. So if you have a JPEG, for example, that you want to bring in, or a movie file, or both, you will have them somewhere on your hard drive, and you will import them into this panel. And they're not actually going to import into the project. The After Effects projects files are actually rather small. They just link to the actual assets elsewhere on your hard drive. But for working with them in After Effects, they're going to show up here. If you've ever used Adobe InDesign, it's a lot like that, where you'll have your assets sort of linked externally. And that has some major benefits, because what you can do is you can work on very complex projects within After Effects, and if you need to change one asset, you don't have to change it 50 times in After Effects. You can change it in the original file, and it will reflect the changes immediately within After Effects. Over here on the right, this is your Effects and Presets panel. Now, the Effects and Presets can also be accessed up here in the Effects window. I very much like having a panel just for it, though, especially because of this search box. Makes it much easier to get to your commonly used effects. And you'll be using these a lot. This is sort of a central tool in After Effects, and when we get working into some projects, I'll be able to show you them. Right above that is the Preview panel. This is where your playback controls are. So a lot of software will have that sort of control right here in the middle beneath your composition window and above your timeline. After Effects puts it up here in a panel. Now, of course, you can move it, but actually, as you get more comfortable with the software, you'll find you probably won't use this panel all that much. There's a lot of key commands in After Effects, mostly for playback, that allow you to skip a lot of the tools in this panel. But as you can see, you have first frame, previous frame, play, pause, tools that you're probably familiar with, including mute and loop options, and RAM preview, which is probably my most used tool here. Above here, we have the audio panel. We also have the info panel. These toggle in the same position. The info panel will show you the RGB and alpha measurements of anything you happen to be hovering over. Now, I'm not hovering over anything right now, so there is no RGB alpha. And these are, of course, your standard RGB numbers. It also shows you the coordinates of where your mouse is at that moment, which, depending on how you work, can be very, very useful. Up here in the top bar on the left is our tools. Just like in Photoshop or Illustrator, you would have tools running down here. We have them running across. And some of these tools you're probably familiar with. You have your regular selection tool, a hand tool for moving around, zoom tools, rotation. The camera tool is one that's unique to After Effects. Pan behind, unique to After Effects. Rectangle tool, pen tool, text tool, and so on. Up here on the right, there's a drop down for changing your workspace layout. So like I said before, we're working in a standard workspace, but you can switch that. So let's say we want to do all panels. Now, this is going to be a bit overwhelming, but you can see it added a whole bunch of other panels into our interface, and we can just go back to standard at any time. If you create a layout of panels and windows that you like best, you can go under here and do new workspace and save it as a custom workspace that you can easily switch to. And then there's a search help text field up here that I've never actually used, so I can't tell you exactly how that works. Behind the project panel is a blank panel called Effect Controls. This is a very key area, just like the effects panel over here is pretty key. When you apply an effect to an object in your composition, the parameters and the options for that effect are going to show up here. It's hard to visualize without actually having it here, so I'll get into that in much greater detail in a little bit. So switching back to project, so now we want to make a composition. Now what is a composition? Now a composition is what you work in, and you can have many of them within an After Effects project. So if you're used to Final Cut Pro, you have sequences, and you can have many sequences within Final Cut Pro. Same idea here. There's not really an equivalent in something like Photoshop because each Photoshop file stands alone. In Adobe Illustrator, if you're familiar with artboards, you can have multiple artboards. It's kind of like that, but it wouldn't be entirely fair to say it's exactly like that. So a composition is where you work. Each composition has an area in here that'll show up and its own timeline. And compositions are very powerful because you can do all sorts of great things, like you can nest compositions within each other, and it allows you to create very organized files, very organized projects. To create a composition, there's multiple ways, and this will always be your first step. One is you can just go up to the menu up here, Composition, and choose New Composition. Alternatively, you could right-click anywhere in the project panel, this blank area in here, and say New Composition. And the final way is you can click this button down here, Create a New Composition. No matter which of those three ways you use, you'll always get this window here, and this is the Composition Settings window. And it looks a little overwhelming, but it's really not that bad, especially when you consider that you probably won't change most of these options most of the time. You can see the very first thing you have at the top is the composition name. Comp 1 is sort of the default name that you'll have. If you have more than one composition there, it might say Comp 2, Comp 3, Comp 4, and so on. You'll want to name this in the interest of keeping your project organized and making it easier for yourself. Give it a name. So I'm going to name it Tutorial. Next up here we have Preset. Now these are common settings that fill in all of this here. So if you're working for an HD TV in the United States, this is probably a good place to start. 720 at 29.97 frames per second. So you can see it fills in the width and the height. It gives us a square pixel aspect ratio, which is ideal for this sort of work, and it gives us a standard NTSC frame rate. If you want to do something a little bit bigger, you could do 1080. You can see it changed stuff. It also changed the aspect ratio to be 1.33. I prefer to work here unless the project calls for it otherwise. I also do prefer to work in square pixels whenever possible. So we're going to keep this as our default. Down here we have resolution full. I've never changed that. I like to keep that full. Start time code I never touch. And duration is whatever you want the duration of your project to be. Now 30 seconds is a good starting place. If you know ahead of time that it's going to be a 2-minute project, you can change that right here. I'm going to keep it at 30 seconds. Now if you start with a certain duration or even a certain resolution, and you realize down the line that you need to change it, you can always come back to this window. So under Composition menu, there's a Composition Settings, and that brings back this window for whatever composition you're working with at that moment. So you can never should feel locked into what you've put into this area. So that looks good. Background color, I'm going to choose black for now. That'll look the most familiar. There's also an Advanced tab up here. For now, we're going to skip all of this. This lets us adjust things like anchor point, renderer, frame rates for nesting, all sorts of advanced options. So I'm going to hit OK. And so here's our first composition. Now you can see a bunch of things have changed since we started. We now have a new list item here. This is our composition in the project. This will accompany any assets that we bring in, photos, music, video. They'll all live over here. We also now have a timeline, and we can see there's all sorts of new icons down here for this timeline. And, like I mentioned before, we can now see our composition, albeit at 50% full size, in the middle here in our composition panel. So, we need to make something. Well, let's make a very simple animation of a square moving from left to right. It's going to be about as straightforward as you can get. So to start making that, we're going to click on the rectangle tool. Now, just like other Adobe software, if you click and hold, there's always alternative tools under many of these options. So text tools have different text options. And so now I'm just going to choose the rectangle tool. And you can see right now the rectangle has a red fill and a 2-pixel white stroke. If I want to change these, I can click up here and change the color to whatever I want. I can click the stroke and change it to whatever I want. If I don't want to have a 2-pixel stroke, I can just click here and type 0. So I'm going to draw a square. Now I'm going to hold down the Shift key to lock the aspect ratio. If I don't hold down Shift, it's going to go all over the place. If I do hold down Shift, there's a perfect square. And now I'm going to click the selection tool to get off that. And now you can see we have even more. We have our red square in the composition window. And now down here in the timeline, we have a new shape layer. This is our red square. You can see when I click on the shape layer, here it is selecting, giving us the bounding box around the red square. It also shows us there's contents to this, there's transform options. Don't let that worry you. We're just going to minimize that. We're going to click this little triangle. And so we just have a red square, and it's its own layer. Over here on the far left, I'll show you what all these icons mean. Over here on the far left, there is an eye icon. This determines the visibility of this layer. There's a blank area here. If this layer had sound, if it was a video layer, there would be a option to toggle on or off the audio. This icon here is solo. So if I click it and there were other layers, this would make it so all the other layers besides this one are invisible. If you've done all the work that you need to do with this layer, you can lock it, and that's what this does. And you can see it doesn't let me do anything. You can change the color of the label. So if you don't want this to be a blue, it's calling it blue. I don't see it. You can change it to seafoam. You can change it to pink. You can change it to whatever you want. By default, After Effects applies certain color labels to certain types of assets. So you won't be stuck with a single color here anyway. So I like to keep it unless I'm working on a highly specialized project. It also gives you the number of this layer. This is layer number 1. The star icon here indicates that it's a shape. We also have this little guy. That's a little face, and that's called Shy. And what Shy does, if I click that, he hides behind this little bar. He has his nose stuck out now. Now he's just hiding. His little top of his head is still there. And what that means is I can have maybe, it's very easy to get an After Effects composition with hundreds of layers. And it's not also uncommon to have 85 of those layers not mean anything to you at any given time. So you just want to work on the 15 layers that matter to you. So you'll take the 85 that don't, enable this little Shy guy, and then you can hide them. They're still there in the composition, but they're just hidden. So you can see hides all layers for which shy is set. So if I unset that and click this, you can see nothing happens. This little sun here is for collapse transformations. That's for a comp layer. If it's for a vector layer, it means continuously rasterize. That means nothing to you right now. Don't worry about it. This little icon here means wire, draft, or best. This is a quality selector. There's an option here to turn on or off effects that you have applied to it. We have not applied any effects to it yet. The next option is for frame blending. That interpolates the frame content. Then we have this. This is motion blur, and I'll show you that in a minute. That turns on and off motion blur. And if you notice, these icons here, a lot of them have friends up here. They're the same thing. So just like we showed you with shy, I enable it here and then I turn it on here. So you can sort of set a whole bunch of layers to be shy, do this. Set a whole bunch of layers to be motion blur and turn it on here. This icon here is an adjustment layer. So effects applied to this layer will apply to all the layers below it. And then this icon here is a 3D layer. And so a 3D layer has a litany of other attributes that we will not get into just yet. And then there's parent. This is another concept that I'll get into at another time. So that's our new shape layer. Now, it's got a lot going on here, but rest assured, you'll probably only select it and turn it on and off. That's about all you'll be doing at this stage. So now we want it to move. So how do we animate this box? Well, if I just move it around, it's not really animating. It's just moving it around the composition, just like Photoshop or Illustrator. So I want to get this to go from here all the way over to here, and I want it to do it in about 6 seconds. So to do that, I'll find its starting point, and I'll put it right there. Now, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to jump into the world of keyframes. So I'm going to expand this option again. So when I expand it, I can see this layer has a rectangle. It's actually a square, but for After Effects purposes, it's a rectangle. So I'm going to collapse that because we don't need to know that. But I am going to go and say transform. And if I open transform, you'll see there's anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. These are the basic transformation properties of After Effects. And they also all have this little stopwatch icon next to them. Those stopwatch icons, and you'll see them a lot in After Effects, means you are looking at an animatable property. So in this case, we want to animate position. So to start that animation, we're going to click the little stopwatch icon to start our first keyframe. And there it is. There's our very first keyframe. It's at 0 seconds, and it is at 254.0 by 326.2. That's its, that is its, what's the word I'm thinking of? Its coordinates in the composition. So now I'm going to take this yellow guy. Now this yellow guy is attached to the red line, and this is our playhead. So again, if you're familiar with Final Cut Pro or Premiere or iMovie, this is the same thing you've seen 50 times before. So we're going to move our playhead to about 6 seconds there, and you can see my time display over here is at 6 seconds, 180 frames at 29.97 frames per second. And now I want to say this box, I want it to be over here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it. And as I drag it, I'm going to hold Shift. Just like holding Shift restrains the aspect ratio of a square as I create it, holding Shift as I drag an item will restrict its movement along the axis on which I'm dragging it. So I'm moving it mostly left to right, so it is not going to let it move up and down. So I'm going to move it all the way to the right, and you can see it draws this little line to show me where it started and when it began. And I'm going to hit off of that. So now, if I drag my playhead back, there we go. We have frame 1 and frame 180. So now if I want to preview this in real time, I'm going to go up here to our preview panel with our playback controls, and I'm going to click this button. This is RAM Preview. What this does is it renders all of what you have going on in this frame. Now in this case, not very much is going on, so it'll happen pretty much in real time. And it takes that render and it saves it into your RAM. So the more RAM you have in After Effects, the better, especially for this tool. So I'm going to click it, And there it goes. So it rendered through it really quickly, and now it's playing back for me. And you can see it takes about 6 seconds, and it lands where it's supposed to. Now it's going to keep playing because this is a 30-second composition. So I'm just going to click to stop it. Now, RAM preview, from what I can see from most people who use After Effects, is almost never instigated from this button. Almost always you're going to want to use the 0 button on your number pad. Not the 0 key on the numbers above your keyboard, but you have to have a number pad. And it's a big 0. It's going to be next to the decimal point and the enter key and to the right of your arrow pad. So when you click, it'll just start playing. That is far more convenient. You will use RAM preview a lot. So, and clicking 0 again will stop the RAM preview and put you back where you were. You can use spacebar to play back, but it's not quite the same as a RAM preview. And you can see it leaves the playhead where you were, which is actually a lot closer to typical video software. So there we have it. We have a new composition, we've learned the basics of some of the interface of After Effects, and we have a square that moves from left to right. If you have any questions about anything I've covered in this video, please feel free to leave me a comment, and I'll do my best to answer them. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.